Are you ready, friends? Our next presenter is a man of many interests. His day job in market research, where he has spent 25 years of his professional life. He is also a certified health coach, which he leverages in the side business he runs with his wife, H3H Training and Consulting. And if that isn't enough to keep him busy, over the past 4 years, he has served as a volunteer state coordinator for the nonprofit Braver Angels, which he is working to bridge the increasing partisan divide in our country. A husband, a father, a pickleball fanatic, and Toastmaster since 2019, Jeff Spitzer was our 2022 District 7 champion of the International Speech Contest with his Braver Angels inspired speech, Depolarizing Within. Here today to talk about how to avoid the pitfalls of public speaking in today's politically charged world. Please help me welcome Jeff Spitzer.
Thank you, Lori. Boy, it's awesome to be back in person, right? Although I got to admit, I feel a little comforted having the Zoom screen right there on the back wall for me. Makes me feel at home. And the other thing I'll just say is I've met a lot of you online, but this is the first time in person for many of you. And you're much better looking in person. I'll tell you what. Well, maybe not Bob. I don't know where Bob went, but the rest of you, much better looking in person. Thank you. So my idea for this talk today was inspired by a couple of different experiences. When I was invited to speak by a fellow Toastmaster to their group a little over a year ago, I was excited. I was branching out of Braver Angels. It was Braver Angels because this person had seen my contest speech from 2 years ago and was inspired by it and invited me to come to their group. And I'd done several, over the last 4 years, I've done actually dozens of presentations for Braver Angels, and they're the standard Braver Angels presentation. And about the time that they approached me with this idea, I was thinking about adapting that speech that I had done in 2022 and turning it into like a 20-minute talk. And I tested it out at a faith group that I'd spoken to just a couple of weeks earlier, and it went well. I mean, there was a couple rough spots, no big deal. I figured I could smooth them out. Because I'd given talks to Rotary clubs, faith groups, civic organizations, and always well received. So my wife and I, we made a weekend out of it. We went out, we spent the whole weekend. The weather was beautiful. I show up to speak. It's a full room, not unlike this. And I was so excited to get up there and again, try out my adapted Toastmaster speech. Boy, I wasn't a minute in and I knew I was in trouble. I started seeing the scowls on faces, body language like this right here. And then the hands started going up. Like a minute, two in, I wasn't prepared to take questions like right when I started. It was like messing me up. And the questions were not really questions. They were like, well, what about the other side? Those crazy people, they're doing this. What they're trying to do is going to ruin our country. I was not prepared for that. And I must have looked like a deer in headlights because that's certainly how I felt. And to make matters worse, they were throwing eggs and tomatoes at me. No, not literally, but I certainly felt like they were. And the only reason they weren't is because there weren't any in the room. At least that's how it felt to me. Maybe it wasn't that bad, but I kind of think it was because my wife, those of you who know my wife know that she is sweet, she is kind, she's always the person who sees the silver lining and sees the good in everything. And as we left that day, she was like, yeah, you screwed that up. And so, like, I knew that I could do better. And so I went back and I started to deconstruct what went wrong for me. And there's a couple of things. First, I knew myself. I had that piece. And what we're gonna talk about today is the things that I think are really important. And number one is knowing yourself, and knowing yourself in this politically charged environment that we live in. I don't think, well, does anybody disagree with me that we live in like historically polarizing political times? Like, yeah, agreed. And it's gotten to the point where if you let somebody know that you are different than them politically, then you automatically sort of get labeled as the enemy. And so that the first thing is knowing myself and knowing where I stood, not just politically, but how polarized I am politically. And I felt pretty good about that. I've been doing the Braver Angels work for now over 4 years, and I've got my polarization down to, a smoldering ember at this point. And the other thing is knowing your audience. And I certainly knew my audience, because what I haven't told you yet is this group was one of the political parties, the county meeting of that political party. And I knew that they sat very firmly on one side of the fence, but I did not take that into account when I walked in there. I approached it like I was talking to a Rotary club, bridge builders, people who were wanting to figure out how to understand and how to work together. And that's not what this audience was. This audience very firmly had their agenda, and more power to them. And that's sort of the environment that we live in right now. I'm not going to tell you who invited me or what the audience was, which party it was, because honestly, it doesn't matter. I've heard from fellow Braver Angels who've spoken to the other party and had a similar experience when they made the same mistake as I did and didn't properly prepare and take the audience in mind. The second inspiration for my talk today is this year's speech contests. I didn't compete this year. I was really disappointed in my performance last year. I was like, you know what? I'm taking next year off. I decided that a year ago. And I decided I was going to volunteer this year. And so I volunteered for a lot of contests around the district. And I heard a lot of great speeches. I heard some not so great speeches too, but I heard a lot of great speeches and table topics. But the other thing that I heard is I heard people unknowingly letting the cat out of the bag in terms of where they stood politically, by stories that they told, by words that they used. And that was fine by me. Like I said, I've been doing the depolarization work for a while now, and it didn't bother me one bit. But I could tell which side of the fence they were on. And so what that told me is, for somebody who is highly polarized politically, if they picked up on that as well, and I'm sure some did, that it's very likely that they might have labeled them, discounted them, and tuned them out at that point. And you don't want that. So especially in a contest, you don't want your judges. It's not a judging criteria. However, judges are human, and sometimes these things will affect how we score and how we judge people. So whether you consider yourself a leader or not, and after Paul Harvey's speech, I'm just kidding. It was me who called him Paul. I was like, I just wanted to tell you the rest of the story. Some of you got it. After his speech today, if you don't see yourself as a leader, I'm here to tell you that as a Toastmaster, when you're standing in front of a room, even if it's your home club, you are seen as a leader when you're standing up there. And in my opinion, a good leader tries to include everyone in their message and make sure that their message reaches every ear in the room and doesn't get tuned out because of political differences. So let's talk about how to do that together. We're going to work on a few things together today. The first thing we're going to do is explore within. So as I mentioned, I think where it starts is understanding ourselves and how politically polarized we might be. But before we do that, let me just say this. You might hear me say some things that ruffle your feathers a little bit, that make you uncomfortable, or that you disagree with. And that's okay. We're not here to debate issues. We're not here to say that one thing is right and the other is wrong. We're here simply to understand how polarized we are politically and how that may be unwittingly showing up. So the examples that I give you, if they make you uncomfortable, that's good. Lean into that, because that means there's something that might be seeping out when you're speaking, not just in front of groups, but at work, amongst your friends, and it's something to be aware of. So what we're going to do is a little exercise from a Braver Angels workshop called The Polarizing Within. So I'm going to ask you a series of 6 questions. And I want you to write down your answer. Now, I'm not going to ask you to reveal your political leaning or anything like that. So grab something to write with and something to write on. If you don't have pen and paper, use your phone. You have my permission to get your phone out and take some notes on your phone. Because let me just ask, who here is interested in building rapport with their audience when they're doing a speech? Yeah, okay. Who wants to ensure that their message comes across to as many people as possible when they're speaking? So, and who wants to know if any polarization that they might have internally is affecting how they're received by the audience, and make some corrections? Okay, those of you who aren't raising your hands, that's all right. We'll get to you. All right, you got a pen and paper ready? All right, I'm going to need my glasses to read this. So I'm going to ask you a series of 6 questions, as I mentioned. And as you think about your answers to these questions, do it in the context of how you think about the large number of Americans who differ from you politically. Now, you might find it helpful to think about all those people who vote for a political candidate like Donald Trump or Joe Biden, or who stand for a policy that you find bad for the country, something like single-payer health care or building a southern wall, whatever it is. Think about those people, right? Okay, here we go. Question number 1. How often do I find myself thinking about those people on the other political side without regard for the variation among them? Often, sometimes, or never. And if you'd like me to repeat the question, let me know and I'll be happy to do so. Yes? Okay, I'll repeat all the questions. How often do I find myself thinking about those people on the other political side without much regard for the variation among them? So usually we're quite familiar with the variation on our own side, but we see the other side is all the same. Often, sometimes, or never. Question 2. How often do I find myself assigning mainly self-serving or negative motives to the other group and mainly positive motives to my group? Often, sometimes, or never. Again, how often do I find myself assigning mainly self-serving or negative motives to the other group and mainly positive motives to my group? Often, sometimes, or never. And you online folks, I hope you're doing this too. This is for everybody, including you. All right, question number 3. How often do I find myself focusing on the most extreme or outrageous ideas and people on the other side, thereby making it hard to see how a reasonable person could remain in that group? Often, sometimes, or never. Again, how often do I find myself focusing on the most extreme or outrageous ideas and people on the other side, thereby making it hard to see how a reasonable person could remain in that group? Question 4. How often do I find myself comparing the worst people on the other side to the best people on my side? How often do I find myself comparing the worst people on the other side to the best people on my side? Often, sometimes, or never. Question 5. How often do I feel a rush of pleasure with friends when we ridicule those crazies on the other political side? How often do I feel a rush of pleasure with friends when we ridicule those crazies on the other political side. Often, sometimes, or never. Last question. Which of the following is closest to my overall emotional attitude towards the majority of people who support the other side? Hate, they are enemies out to destroy the country. Disdain, they are ignorant and should know better. Pity, they are well-meaning but duped. Basic respect, they make contributions even if they are mostly off base. Or respect and appreciation, they make unique and necessary contributions. Again, which of the following is closest to my overall emotional attitude towards the majority of people who support the other side? Hate, disdain, pity, basic respect, or respect and appreciation. Take a few seconds and review your answers. I'd like you to reflect on them for a moment. All right, let's get some volunteers. Who had an insight from this activity? Who learned something about themselves and would like to share? Yes. Highly polarized. Thank you for admitting that. Yeah. I will. Who else? Back of the room. Oh, he said he better start changing because he's an awful person. I wouldn't go that far. You're just polarized. Well, I don't know. Donna, what do you think? Is he? Who else had it? Anybody online too? Please raise your Zoom hand if you'd like to interject from online. Yes.
One thing I discovered while I was but I've been on and I have I've been on I realized it's not by color.
Yes. Absolutely. Including pathways. Truth. All right, one more. Anybody on this side of the room? One more. Okay, Jim, right here.
So Jeff, the main thing this made me think about was that the people that I know personally, I would respond differently to these questions than the people that I don't know personally. When I think about all those people out there that I don't know and I think about them, I react one way, but the people that I know personally and I talk to, I react a different way.
Isn't that something? Excellent insight. Excellent insight. You knew where I was going, didn't you, Jim? You spoiled the ending. Just like Randy's daughter peeking at the back of the book. So, yeah. So if you had a reaction, if you learned something about yourself and you realize that, hey, maybe I am kind of polarized, that's okay. That's the environment we live in. It's a natural cause of what's happening in the world these last dozen. Actually, it's been going on for way more than a dozen years. An interesting study from Pew Research back in like 2014 that talked about the increasing gap between the left and the right. So we're here. Now we got to decide what we're going to do about it. So first step is understanding yourself. And if you just realized that you do have a level of polarization, if you answered often in those questions that I just gave you, then that's something that you should be aware of, and now you are. So the second step, I believe, is understanding your audience. Now, in the story that I told, I understood the audience. I just didn't take it into consideration. I didn't adapt to it. That was a huge miss on my part. So don't be like me. You're here. I'm here today because of that experience and because I don't want you to make the same mistake. So what I want you to take into account whenever you're speaking to a group is who the group is. Now, I would guess that most of the time it's going to be a mixed audience. It might lean predominantly left or right, We're in Portland. I'm guessing this room probably leans left since we're in Portland after all. But I know that there are many conservatives in the room as well. And so I would consider this a mixed audience. Now, in the story that I told, I wasn't speaking to a mixed audience. I was speaking to a group that was very firmly on one side of the fence. And I could have done a lot of things differently, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But the first thing I needed to do was take that into consideration and structure my stories in such a way to appeal to that audience. And I didn't. I started with a story about a COVID disagreement, and I got a whole lot of hell yeah, in the room. That's not what you want. You want, if you're trying to get people to see common ground, then you want to bring them there with your stories. And I was doing the opposite. I was firing them up. And the other thing you can do is try to gain some buy-in with your audience, like ask them leading questions and such, which we'll get into in just a moment. Now, most of the time, as I mentioned, you're probably going to be speaking to a mixed audience. So if you're speaking to your own group, your own political group, you want to use words and stories that will let them know that you're part of them and that you're one of them, right? And you're going to gain rapport that way. If you're speaking to a mixed group or the group on the other side of you politically, you want to remain as neutral as possible. So you don't want to tell a story. So if you're speaking to a mixed or a right-leaning group and you happen to want to tell a story about this large gathering you went to, and the large gathering happened to be the Democratic National Convention, maybe don't tell that story. Or maybe if the fact that it was the DNC is not pertinent to the story, leave that part out. You just went to a large story. So don't take things out of your story that are going to reveal yourself politically, okay? And I would guess that's going to be most of the time you want to remain neutral. Now, the third thing I would say to do at this point is to get buy-in. So in my opinion, every good presentation starts with a story. And if you can make that story, as I just mentioned, like in the flavor of that audience, that's going to help you build rapport. But even if you don't, you can get buy-in by asking them some leading questions. So going back from what I learned from in that experience, what I've done since are things, asking them questions like, which I'll ask you. Who here has lost friendships or been estranged from family members due to political differences? Anybody? Yeah. See? Who here is tired of the constant vilification on social media? Yeah, me too. Who wants to avoid a civil war? I would hope everybody in this room, right? Who wants to connect with people as fellow human beings again? Yes. Yes. If I had started like that, I think I would have had a much different outcome. And made some other tweaks. I made a lot of mistakes that day. So understand yourself and how your polarization might come out. Understand your audience and how you should direct your stories and your buy-in from them to build rapport. We've got a lot of great presenters and speakers, experienced speakers in the room. I'd love to hear from any of you. What are some other ways that you've built rapport with your audience? Anybody? Listen, I heard. I saw a hand in the back.
Oh, using words to let them know that we're together. So like team or community even. So that way they know that we are together in this project or whatever it is.
Yes.
There's no other.
Thank you. Gwen?
Hold on.
Oh, Patrick wants to get you that microphone.
I thought it was coming from one place or the other.
I said authenticity because people can tell just by the words you say, are you real or are you not? And we are looking for real
Yes.
in this polarized world.
That's an excellent point, because when I said use words and phrasing that are going to appeal to that audience, I don't want anybody to, I hope you didn't hear me say do that disingenuously. Never do that. They're going to see through that. So when you're speaking to your own political group, or people who lean on that side, then you want to show them that you're one of them. If you're speaking to the other side, don't try to fake it. Don't use words and phrases and stories that are going to make it appear that you're on their side. No, just stay neutral. Just keep your stories neutral. Yes. Who else has built rapport with an audience in a different way? What? Jim, were you raising your hand? That was like half-hearted, like,
Because you actually said it just a moment ago, where it's when you're telling the story at the beginning of your speech, you're establishing common ground because you're sharing something that people have in common.
Mhm.
If you talk about your grandmother, a lot of people also had grandmothers, so you're establishing common connection.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of which, when I talked about my bombed presentation, has anybody else bombed the presentation before because they didn't take their audience into account? I see some hands. Yeah, thank you. I'm not alone. Thank you.
Hey, Jeff,
Great.
back on your previous question from the Zoom room, Wendy Kozlowski says she agrees to disagree and dialogue is helpful in establishing that community.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Oh, one more.
Thank you. I would say, building on what everyone said, it's tugging at the heartstrings at the very beginning. So that emotion, to allow that connection right at the beginning, can help with the empathy.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, one more. Last one.
Yeah, maybe run to the other side of the room. Yeah.
Patrick needs his exercise today.
Well, I'm a middle of the roader, and I've been able to offend both sides at the same time, and I became the common enemy.
You hear that? The common enemy. So if you don't like what I have to say next, direct it right over here. Now, the next point I want to talk about is choosing your words carefully. As I mentioned when I was volunteering for contests around the district this year, I heard not a lot, but they were just small. A word here, a word there that I recognized as having more of a bias to one political side or the other. And so this is where you can unwittingly let the cat out of the bag. Not that you were trying to hide it necessarily, though that's sort of what I'm saying. I don't want you to hide who you are, but I just want to make sure that your audience doesn't tune you out, okay? It's unfortunate that this is the world we live in right now. So again, in your own group, use words. I'm going to belabor these points because they're important. In your own group, use words, phrases, stories that will build rapport. In mixed or opposite, you want to be neutral. Now, you might be asking yourself, what words is this guy talking about right now? Well, this is where I expect that there might be some disagreement in the room. And if I ruffle any feathers here, it's kind of got to happen. So let's dive into it. I don't want to get caught up, though, in whether you agree or disagree that some of the examples that I give you right now have a left or a right bias, okay? Just know that these examples are giving you are from a language guide that Bravery Angels put together. It's got over 200 words in there that they've rated as having a left-leaning bias or a right-leaning bias, and then they also rated them on a polarity scale from 0 to 3, 3 being highly polarized. And this guide, which I'll tell you as I close how you can get your hands on it if you're interested. It was compiled by thousands of surveys that they did with Bravery Angels members and non-members, and you can also participate in that survey and help shape the future of that guide. So let's not get caught up in whether these are right or wrong in your mind. Good? Okay. All right, this is the part I'm nervous about. So let's rip the Band-Aid off. I'm in Multnomah County. I'm guessing there's a lot of blues in the room, so let me piss off most of the room first. If you are using, I'm going to give you 6 examples from each side. Here are 6 blue examples for you. If you are using phrases like gender assigned at birth. Ooh, I've already got some groans. All right. Equity, inclusive, microaggression, activist, or preferred pronouns. If you use these in your language, you are letting people know that you have a blue or a left-leaning bias, especially with the preferred pronouns. If you are in a Zoom room and you have your pronouns next to your name, without even opening your mouth, you've let people know that you have a left bias. Okay? So it's something to be aware of. Again, I'm not saying it's right or it's wrong. And I'm sure some of you are saying, well, these are the proper ways to say these things. That's the right way. That's okay. I'm not here to argue that. I'm just letting you know that people who think differently than you, you're letting them know that you lean left and they might tune you out if they are highly polarized. Okay? All right, let's deal with the rest of you. Now let's some right-leaning biased words for you. 6 examples there. Biological sex. Big government. Homosexual. Traditional marriage. Family values. Personal responsibility. If you're using, these are 6 examples of over 200 words in this language guide. If you're using these in your language, you're letting people know that you have a right-leaning bias. And if you're speaking to a blue room or a mixed audience, they might tune you out because of it, because they don't view you as somebody who sees the world differently. They view you as the enemy. Not everybody, but a highly polarized person might do that. And the thing about these words is that if you heard any of these and you're like, well, that's how you say it. Isn't that how everybody says it? See, we live in silos now. We live in echo chambers. We have friends who talk like us. We get our news from sources that use these same words, and we don't even realize that another world exists. And if we do, those people are wrong, and I don't want anything to do with those people, right? And that's what we're trying to avoid here. So, at risk of getting any virtual tomatoes thrown at me, not questions on these, but any comments, anything land with somebody a certain way. Greg has something from the audience, from the online audience.
From the Zoom, Sue Church Hoskins suggests that diversity was one word that stirs up a little bit.
Yep. Jim.
Jim, hold on, Jim. I might have to put one right by.
Actually, as you were saying that and explaining that, I realized that I actually am bilingual because I've been with certain people, I use certain phrases, and with other people, I use other phrases. And I realized I just do that naturally because I understand what their feelings are, and so I try to use the phrase that they.
Interesting. So you mirror to them. Yeah. Very chameleon.
What do you use on me, Jim?
Anybody else? Over this side of the room.
Yeah, it's kind of a question, but it occurs to me that some of these, not some are going to be trained, but say diversity by itself could be taken one way, but then if you, the way you inflected it, oh yeah, diversity, that has a major impact as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Connotation.
But yeah, a lot of words, it depends how you use them. For example, woke could be an example of that. Those who consider themselves woke might use that with a lot of pride, right? But those who are on the other side would be like those crazy woke people, right? So there's a lot of examples of that. Thank you. Great example. One more. We're going to run out of time and he's going to run out of energy.
You're bringing up a lot of points that I really need to be careful of myself because I am somewhat right-leaning and I'm a member of a very left-leaning club, so.
Well, they still have you in the club, right? Or is it just because you pay your dues?
Oh, they still have me in the club.
Thank you, Alden.
And they can't vote you out, you know that, right?
So let me just quickly recap where we're at here. So first step, understand yourself. Understand how polarized you are, okay? Second, understand the group that you're speaking to, and what's more, take that into consideration as you craft your words for that group. Use stories, questions to build rapport, get buy-in. Use your words carefully, your word choices, that you're not going to like cause somebody in the room to tune you out because they think of you as an other, okay? So as I wrap up today, I'm hoping that you learned something about yourself in the exercise that we did. I'm hoping that you learned something about how to craft your messages for your future audiences in this highly polarized world. And I'm also hoping that you start to examine how this shows up in other areas of your life. So if you are somebody who answered often in those questions, like, how's it showing up on your social media posts, in where you're getting your news from, your friend groups, and of course, as we've talked about today, in your speeches. Examine these things and decide what you want to do about it. That's for you to decide. I'm hoping that you will take it into account and start to appeal to a wider audience. And especially for those of you who learned something about yourself that you might be more polarized than you're comfortable with, a few things I'll leave you with. Now, I don't want to give you too much, but I think this is important. Get curious. Start to seek out different opinions on issues that are important to you, okay? See what the other side actually says about it. Not the rhetoric, not the, the far extreme talking points, but the legitimate concerns about the issues. And in doing so, don't assume the worst. Let's assume the best in people. Let's not assume that they are bad people. It's so easy to discount people who are different than us by just saying they're bad people, they're evil, they're whatever, and just label them and discard them. And that's not how we're going to move forward as a country. That's not how we're going to move forward as society or as Toastmasters. So from the starting point of, let's take that off the table. They're not evil. Assuming that they're not evil for argument's sake, what's another possible explanation for why they believe what they believe? And I don't mean for this to be an advertisement for Braver Angels, though I realize it's kind of shaping up that way, but but Braver Angels is a great place. There are other organizations like Braver Angels that do the same kind of work, but Braver Angels I'm obviously very bought into, and in Braver Angels you can learn communication skills where you can learn to talk with somebody who thinks differently than you. You can actually meet people and have one-on-one conversations and meet people. So if you live in a bubble and you don't know anybody who thinks differently than you politically, Braver Angels is a great place to get that. And I'm going to give you, if you want to write this down, on my webpage, I just created a quick page that has the main talking points that I covered today. And I've linked some resources to you and where you can get the language guide. So those of you, if you're already a Braver Angels member, the language guide is available to you in the members portal. If there's not, I got permission for you to email somebody who will give you permission to get the language guide without joining. But at any case, write down my website. It's very simply myh3h.com/TM for Toastmasters. Simply the letters MYH, the number 3, the letter H.com/TM. I believe that working on this together, we can write better presentations, we can reach more people with our message, and hopefully, eventually, we can reverse this negative tide of polarity that we're seeing in this country. Thank you.